We need to talk about the media. This is a snapshot of how the media can win you an election. This isn't everything. I don't know if there's enough camera film in the world to film everything just from since Corbyn's become leader. And in isolation, these seem like innocent mistakes. My thinking is that by listing some of the things the BBC and the rest of the media stands accused of, that I can flip the assumption made by most of us that our own broadcaster couldn't possibly treat us like such pawns. Instead of being grilled by Andrew Neil like the other leaders, including Corbyn, Boris wormed out, and his interview slot replaced with a segment on Boris making scones and the headline plastered all over the web, just under anything under Labour and anti-Semitism. The BBC allegedly told Labour they had agreed with Boris to do one. That's the only reason why Corbyn did one. They were pre-recorded as well, so that's not down to a mix-up. They could have just held on to it until Boris confirmed. So either the BBC did tell Labour they'd already agreed with Boris, or Boris told BBC he'd do it, then pulled out. Whatever the case may be, the leader is hiding from being held accountable. That makes him officially unfit for office and probably even for the Tory party. On the same day as the scones, nurses were filmed giving Boris a hard time on his visit, asking him if he had a magic nurses tree. The BBC decided not to air it on TV that night. This has happened a lot. Reports of there being drama everywhere Boris has visited has been all over social media, but the BBC especially has refused to pick it up. When a Scottish man asked Corbyn why he believes in the rights of brown people, Corbyn was lambasted for 24 hours, and there was no mention of the Scottish heckler's checkered past when it comes to race issues. It's not my job to identify him and call him out, but it would help if people like that didn't feel so emboldened to just question Corbyn like that on the rights of anyone non-white, like it's a travesty. When a parent approached Boris in the halls of the hospital his daughter was in and demanded to know why Boris thought it was okay to bring a press team to do a shoot around sick children waiting for beds because of his government, Boris then told him there was no cameras, there were no press. Obviously, we see this all through the cameras and the microphones of the press. But Boris looks him square in the eye and tells him there is none. Guess what the news story was around it? Labour member hijacks Boris Visit to heckle him over policy, and the entire journalistic class set about telling this hurt parent a new one. When the BBC reported on a Tory MP being suspended for anti-Semitic comments, they replaced the story 30 minutes later with one that merely read unacceptable comments. Would they so kindly do that for a Labour MP? Laura Quesenberg, BBC political editor, so remember there are strict laws in place over elections concerning impartiality, shared a blog by none other than Dominic Cummings that's literally written to potential Tory voters about what they should do, and using known incitements towards racism to stoke fear into readers, posted much like a sponsored post would be. She didn't mention anything negative, she merely put it out there for her followers to see it. She promoted it. The law states our state broadcaster should remain impartial. I might remind you that this was going on as the biggest election story broke about Trump, the Tories and the NHS, which our PM is still lying about on the media unchecked. On the day after the story broke about the NHS, the BBC woke the whole world up with huge celebrations about the first female member of Parliament being a Conservative. Willfully ignoring the woman who actually was first, shock horror, it was a Sinn Féin MP who fought for the self-determination of Ireland. Are you surprised she's been wiped from the BBC's history books during this election? Constance Markovich was her name. Or are you more surprised to find out the Tories' first woman to sit in Parliament was in fact Nancy Astor, the famous MP, infamous for her claims that Hitler could be the solution to the world's problem of Jews? Just sit back for a second and think about what would happen if Corbyn had spoke at the unveiling of this statue and not Theresa May. I'm yet to hear someone mainstream mention her Nazi tendencies or that the Tory is institutionally anti-Semitic. Labour announced its plans to plant 2 billion trees this week, to which anyone who's been told $1 billion is too big an investment if it's for people and not the rich burst into laughter, throwing around pictures of Diane Abbott around like nobody's business. Because there's obviously nothing like a sweaty white boy denying it's her blackness that they find so funny. Within minutes, the world found out that Ethiopia did 350 million trees in a day, and that a good cedar can plant more than 1,000 in less than an hour. But as always, the BBC have to make sure everyone gets to hear people laughing at Labour for it. So when John McDonnell went onto Radio 4 the next day, the inevitable snigger and condescending comments were made, then justified by, well, people did laugh at it. Yes, because they're thick, because they're brains. It's not because your state broadcaster should pretend that it's a young Boris supporting bricklayer and not understand the seriousness of both the policy and the numbers. Nothing quite beats the cheek of Emily Maitlis on Twitter talking about this. I quote, "We may come to dub this the election of 2 billion trees and 50,000 nurses, where numbers and accountability become meaningless. That's a scary legacy. One is a stupid mistake on your part, the other is a barefaced lie. These people are trying to distort reality. Deep it, please." I've got an interesting task for you this week. Ask anyone 30 years plus what they think of Corbyn. And if they despise him, see how many of them repeat literal newspaper headlines and bulletins and how many back it up with another lie. My guess is around 75% to 100%. Honestly, try it at home. I dare you to find someone with a legitimate, honest answer for why they hate him and won't let the working class get the justice it deserves. Your task is to comment below with the most ridiculous answers people have given about Corbyn. Back onto the BBC, and that Andrew Neil is yet to be asked why he's in Jeffrey Epstein's Black Book, along with frequent BBC guest Toby, "Only my wife stops me from bad sexual habits," Young. Yes, Toby Young really said that in conversation about the Epstein ordeal, and no one on the BBC is talking about it. Andrew Neil and Nick Robinson, both BBC presenters, are lifelong Tory members. Andrew Neil chairs the publisher of the oft-racist Spectator. Robert Peston, ITV political editor, also writes for the Spectator. Boris Johnson also wrote for the Spectator. They all accuse a man, whilst literally standing accused themselves, of allowing anti-Semitism to fester in public discourse. Anything that publishes these men alongside Rod Liddell is destined for controversy. From Boris's column on Nigerians to Taki Theodorakopoulos' public support of ultra-nationalist Greek parties, and another man who stands accused of anti-Semitism but just isn't on the left, so it doesn't matter. Andrew Neil lied during his Corbyn interview, pretending a potential candidate only got a warning letter when she in fact resigned upon receiving a letter informing her that she was being investigated. Has anyone asked Boris or Joe Swinson why 2 of their candidates have been suspended for anti-Semitic remarks during this campaign? No, I didn't think so. In the BBC, Sky, paper, all of it, the coverage of the US-UK NHS trade talks, Corbyn's been painted as a liar who's just trying to use this to distract from his issues with racism. That is actual TV reporting, that's not my words. Boris has written articles directly attacking the notion of the NHS being free at the point of use as Soviet corruption, lamenting that we don't have an insurance-based health system already. It was only last year that Boris accepted an award from a US pro-market think tank called AEI and spoke of Brexit being an opportunity by saying we'll be, I now quote, able to campaign for pro-competitive policies. That's the opportunity, and I hope very much with you guys, with America, we can work together to deliver this agenda. The US needs no deal to do any trade talks. The US needs it all on the table to complete a trade. If we go out on no deal, we lose our leverage as a nation. We become officially vulnerable to whatever Trump demands. They agreed to not say NHS in case it scared us, and we also found out that Trump intends to use him having us in the bag as a big part of his 2020 campaign. Other Tories have spoken out about Gove, Duncan Smith and Johnson when it comes to the NHS. Just because the BBC want to pretend doesn't mean we forget what we already knew before these documents came out. They're playing on you just taking every word at face value and never joining the context up. Hence the big Tory pushback is, it only says NHS 4 times, like that means everything else they said doesn't exist, like that overrides the context or the facts, like you should honour their efforts to hide it. They're still denying the meetings ever happened with the knowledge of any politician, even though Liam Fox is squarely named on it. It's paramount to there even being a negotiation, but they're telling us the NHS is categorically not on the table. The Tories are pushing for a US deal after no deal and not a deal with the EU. The BBC refuses to talk on economic findings of Boris's deal and throws it into the scaremongering pile when brought up by others, instead of addressing the stark reality that most of the country will live through another recession next year if Boris's deal or no deal goes through, which would make us even more vulnerable than we have been over the 3 years we haven't been able to tell the US no over anything. Even Matt Hancock slipped out that we were partially successful at protecting the NHS, then said if it was on the table that they'd walk away from the trade agreement, to which Adam Bolton said, okay, that will be brilliant, won't it? We won't have a trade deal with the EU and we won't have a trade deal with the US. To which Hancock tries to intercept with, no, we will get a deal, but according to the US, the NHS has to be somewhat up for sale. Hancock knows it's wrong to think that we'll just sign ownership over to the US. It would always be partially on the table, but nonetheless, they've admitted that after 3 years of negotiating, they still haven't been able to get the US to budge, and we're running out of leverage. We hit the inevitable recession after a no deal and all of a sudden it gets spun as a good deal. It won't be the whole NHS, so you'll still technically have the NHS. It just might not be free at the point of use anymore and the clap pill might set you back a week's wages. We actually have a quote from Trump, I think from earlier today on the deal. So we're dealing with the UK on trade and the trade deal and we're going to have a great deal made. I've been dealing with Boris. I just spoke to him yesterday. I'll speak to him again. He and I are very much aligned. We feel very good about each other. I think we'll make a fantastic and big deal with the UK. Actually, we should do much more business than we're doing with the UK. That says it all. The BBC have even been caught editing private emails from Corbyn advisor Seamus Milne during the Panorama Hatchet job. They posted, "Something's going wrong and we're muddling up political disputes with racism. I think going forward we need to review where and how we're drawing the line." This sounds like he's saying there's no racism in the Labour Party at all, and that's how it was spun on the programme, when in fact he was directly referencing that if Jewish activists and survivors of the Holocaust are being accused, then we need to review our process. Fair enough. Let's take it back to the local election now. Still with the BBC. I'll just put this sum out there, you work it out for yourself. Tories, minus 1,330. Labour, minus 84. The headline, equal loss. No words needed. 1,330, 84, equal loss. The BBC is even still allowing guests to blame Labour for the 2007 global crash, whilst someone that sits in our government was part of the bank that was using the dividends that caused the crash. Let's take ourselves back to the Sunday memorial service, when Boris mucked up this year. And some of you may remember when Corbyn made a mistake and was painted as someone who hates the country. Every early morning show discussed it and he sat on the front of every paper. Well, the BBC didn't want that for Boris. So they trawled all the way back to 2016 to play that footage over and over again on BBC to make it look like he didn't make the two gaffes. As always, they claim it to be an innocent mistake. How many until you are pulling our leg? Corbyn's Russian hat. They still deny that, when we have trusted lawyers that claim to have evidence of negative imaging on the BBC when it comes to Corbyn. This isn't all though. Boris's footage being cut and doctored from the question time debate to make it seem like he wasn't jeered over trust issues and that in fact the question was clapped and Boris concise in his reply. When in fact he flustered, they murmured and the BBC used footage from another answer as his to answer it. Again, they claim it was an innocent mistake. Now we're on to the studies though. Studies show the BBC gave little to no voice to anyone who believes in stimulating the economy instead of austerity after the crash. The BBC sold the country to the Tories by selling austerity to us, just like they're trying to persuade you that public investment is the biggest evil in the world. 75% of press coverage factually misrepresents Corbyn. And this is from the London School of Economics. They say the majority of the press did not act as a critical watchdog of the powers that be, but rather more often as an antagonistic attack dog. And it's official, ladies and gentlemen, Jeremy Corbyn is the most smeared politician in British history. I will add that Corbyn has always pushed for an inquiry into the press. And maybe that could be a clue as to why he's earned this title. The media call Labour policies ambitions and Tory ones promises. They equate barefaced lies from Tories with misreporting of Labour policy. They equate public investment with austerity. They equate being honest about marriage tax with making up hospitals. They equate right-wing economic ideology with gospel. They equate hundreds of independent and world-renowned economists with one person from a right-wing think tank. They equate saying the NHS is for sale with selling the NHS off. They equate watching our family die in wards in corridors, waiting for beds and operations, with using the NHS as a political football. They equate the suicide of the disabled, of mothers, fathers, sons and daughters, the cuts, the suffering, the parents who freeze to death waiting for the kids to come home so they can put the heating on. The tax-paying, hard-working adult now forced to die starving, cold and alone because they're ill but not too ill to work. They equate all of this, all of it, with not believing in stimulating a stagnant economy. And I plead you to never forget. This has been another episode of YakChat. This has been Yak. I hope you've been yourself. Peace.